Rare is the wine that spends more time in a barrel. Rare are the vineyards that flourish in a more harsh and unforgiving land. Rare is the grape that is harvested by hand and crushed by foot. The wine is port, and this is Ports to Remember, a discovery of port wine from the grapes to the glass. Come, savor the wine, harvest the grapes, get to know the place and the people whose lives have been wrapped in the joy of port wine for generations. Join your host, wine writer and connoisseur Tony Aspler, in this celebration of Ports to Remember.
Hello, I'm Tony Aspler, and this is Ports to Remember. This book is the cellar book for Warre's Port, and it dates back to 1804. And this house behind me is the house where the Baron de Forester lived in the middle of the 19th century. But these dates mean nothing when you consider just how old Warre's Port is. It's the oldest port house in Oporto, dating back to 1670. And I'll be visiting that port house on Ports to Remember. We're on the hills above Villanova de Gaia, looking across the Douro River to the city of Porto. We're in the garden just outside the lodge of the venerated port house, Warre's, and the view is spectacular. Hello, I'm Tony Aspler, and welcome to Ports to Remember. And today we're going to visit Portugal's oldest port house, Warre's. And with me to describe the scene is Dominic Symington. Hello, Dominic.
Hi, Tony.
Thank you for inviting me here. This is a very majestic setting. Now, Warre's dates back to when?
The original firm, or the first records we have of shipping of wine out from Portugal is in 1670, hence Warre's being the oldest port shipper.
And they lived on this property here?
Not as such, not in this actual house. This house actually belonged to Baron Forester, who was quite an emblematic, very famous, well-known figure in the port trade in the mid-19th century, so the 1850s thereabouts. This was his private home. He lived here, and he sadly died, actually, drowned in the river upstream, and it was shortly after that that this then became our company offices.
I can imagine Porto being crowded to the riverfront. From the water, it seems like it's hardly changed for 100 years. The same narrow grey stone houses with their clay tile roofs. The people, like their washing, hanging over the wrought iron railings, and they invite visitors like me to share their home. The people of Porto, the Portuenses, are fiercely proud of their city and its history. They called it Porto. It was the English that added the O. The city gave its name to the country and to the wine. And somehow this gives the Portuenses ownership of both. Porto is smaller than Portugal's capital, Lisbon, yet it's the commercial hub of the country. We are hard at work, the people say, while the lazy ones in Lisbon lie on the beach. Even the play in Porto has a competitive edge. This game is burro. The person who tosses the most discs in the box wins the prize. Today, the prize is a rooster. The loser of this match supplies the prize for the next. It seems easy enough. And perhaps it is, with practice. So, with my skill, or should I say lack of it, I bid a hasty retreat. It may be a game, but they're very serious about winning. On the water in Porto, graceful skiffs share the river with businesslike barges and freighters. Three bridges connect Porto and Villanova de Gaia. One slender steel structure was designed by Eiffel himself. It seems logical to put a port lodge right on the river. It would be easier to load the wine for shipping. So why is Warre's lodge so high up on the hill? Warre built the first lodge in Gaia, in Villanova de Gaia. Why didn't they build it across the river in Oporto?
I think it was twofold. One was that the offices, the city itself, as we can see, the original city was only this very small central part with the large Bishop's Palace, which is the white building on our right, that tall tower, which is called the Cleric's Tower, to our left. That was essentially the city that came down a steep valley to the river. There was very little space there. So it was natural to try and build it nearby where the offices were, but where there was available land, and it's, relatively speaking, flatter than over that side, and so they built the lodges here. The other reason was that the wines were stored in Oporto rather than at the vineyard in the Douro, because here it's cooler, there's more humidity in the air because we're just next door to the ocean, and therefore you'd get a more even and a softer maturity in the wine. And then lastly, the taxes by the Portuguese at that time were levied on export, and they could control all export from here. As it would go out, loaded onto the ships, they would then take the tax.
Well, let's go and visit Portugal's oldest port lodge.
Delighted, please.
Dominic Symington says it's flatter here. Still, I'm glad to be going downhill. Look at these walls. Granite rocks stacked up 100 years ago or more. This may look like an ordinary door, but walking through is like stepping back in time to the smell of burning oak and ancient wine. The noise of the coopers is deafening, but you've got to admire their skill. Each stave, each strip of oak that goes into the barrel is shaped by hand. They're tapered at both ends without any measurement, yet they fit precisely together to make a consistent size and shape. The fire helps shape the barrel. The heat dries the inside of the staves, warping the wood into the barrel shape.
It will slowly bring them in, and then they can create the belly on the barrel. So they'll put water down. Will help it'll bend the wood, it'll warp it. Basically what they're doing is you're creating a warping process.
But
what they've done on these staves is that it's narrow at the top,
yes,
it's wider in the center, and then they're coming down in a V. There's the hollow space. That is because they have shaved these staves. They've made them purely by eye, and they have shaved those to take in the wasting. When they
each of the 12 metal hoops that go around the cask has a name: mola, javre, colette, and so on. Some 40 tools are used in the making of the barrel, and although oak is being replaced by steel in some places, the art of the cooper should never be lost. More often, however, the coopers are not making barrels, but repairing them. Whoa! What is this?
This is the reason we have the cooperage, because as you can see, those crystals that are formed on the inside is tartrate crystal and also solid matter and the wine, and that cakes the inside of the wood. If the barrel itself is all sound and all the staves are in good condition, we'll do it like this and we'll just scrape out the inside. If one of the staves needs repair, we will dismantle it completely, replace that one. Each one, in fact, if you can see, each one is slightly numbered. They will take it apart in its correct order, take the damaged one out, replace it, and then remake the barrel again.
That's amazing. For new and repaired barrels alike, the last step is the logo, a company label that may sit undisturbed for many years. The last step in this barrel gave us a very pleasant surprise and honor, a different but a very familiar logo. Stay with me for more ports to remember. Traveling up the Douro River over 100 kilometers from Porto, I entered the Cima, or Upper Corgo, the region of the Douro Valley above the Corgo River. Here the scant rainfall, searing heat, and granite soil combine to produce the finest port grapes. The farms are called quintas because they used to pay 1/5 of their income in taxes to the kings of Portugal. Quinta de Cavadinha means the well-tilled quinta. It's on a mountain close to another tributary to the Douro, the Rio Pinhao. The gentle curve to the landscape concentrates the summer heat that is so beneficial to a port grape. This is another Symington, Dominic's cousin Charles. I'm with Charles Symington here at Quinta de Cavadinha, which belongs to Warre's. Now Warre's, as we know, is the oldest of the port houses, but is Cavadinha the oldest quinta?
The vineyard at Cavadinha must be some of the oldest vineyard in the Douro. The plantings here are simply maintained and replacing old vines when they die. The quinta itself has been supplying Warre for many years, since the beginning of the century, although we in fact only acquired the quinta towards the midway through the century.
And you have the 5 traditional port grapes growing on this particular quinta?
Well, traditionally in the Douro, old vineyard is planted with a mixture of different varieties within the same patch. So here we have the main 5 grape varieties: Tinta Barroca, Tinta Roriz, Touriga Nacional, Touriga Francesa, and Tinta Cão.
The best way to understand what Charles is saying is to see it for ourselves. I love it out here in the vineyard, walking through the autumn smell and the crackle of dry leaves.
This is a mix.
Just look at these vineyards. This is a new way of planting in the Douro. Notice the way the vines run down the slope rather than across it. This is called vertical planting, and it makes it easier for tractors and pickers to tend and harvest the grapes. But other areas still have to be planted in terraces. Most of these hills are just too steep for vertical planting. Although the main farmhouse is rarely used, the nearby adega is a scene of the latest winemaking technology. This is where the grapes become wine. But this vinification system is unique. It was designed by Charles's father, Peter, and his winemaking team.
It allows for a permanent pumping over situation throughout the entire fermentation, which extracts colour and structure for the wines. In port making, we have very short fermentations, and so the whole port winemaking process is based around methods of extracting colour.
So the wine actually is pumped over by the action of the gas pressing down on the top.
Yeah.
The cap
on the top, where the skins are floating on top of the wine, and by forcing the wine up to the top to a deposit on the top of the tank, and then releasing it down over the top of the cap is constantly being showered by the must, and the extraction is permanently taking place.
From the auto-vinification tanks, the wine is pumped into huge casks. It will stay here until January, when it's moved downstream to Warre's Lodge at Villanova de Gaia. Well, can we try it?
Yeah.
This particular wine is very young indeed. And there you have it, a 2-week-old baby that could become a vintage port. From a baby wine to the legendary birthplace of port, I traveled to the city of Lamego. Overlooking the town is an incredible cathedral, Nossa Senhora dos Remedios, Our Lady of the Remedies. The cathedral was built in 1761, right over the top of a small chapel dedicated to St. Stephen that had been built almost 4 centuries before that, in 1391. The path to the cathedral steps back and up the hill as if rising almost 700 steps towards heaven. Here in Lamego, I cross a bridge built by the Romans perhaps 2,000 years ago. The crystal stream below tumbles down the hill to join the Douro River, as it did when the bridge was built. If port has a spiritual home, it's here in Lamego, where in 1678 2 English merchants passed by and they stayed the night, and they were served a wine that was fantastic. It was a wine fortified with brandy. Imagine, if you will, those 2 English merchants having had a wonderful dinner here at the Abbey, having had that amazing wine, walking around this cloister, deciding how they were going to import it back to England. The English eventually dominated the port trade, but the King of Portugal's minister, Marquês de Pombal, wrested control away in the late 18th century. This is the original demarcation post to designate the wine-growing area of the Douro Valley. It was placed here at the middle of the 18th century at the orders of the Marquis de Pombal. At that time, the Douro Valley became the first demarcated wine region in the world. Perhaps port has changed since then, but perhaps not. Back in the tasting room at Warre's Lodge in Villanova de Gaia, Dominic and Peter Symington tell me about the importance of continuity to their port wines. Peter Symington is Warre's longtime winemaker. Has the style changed, though, over those years? It must have changed. It couldn't have remained the same for 200 years.
It's always been a young, vigorous, fresh port, lots of colour, fruit, ripe, red fruit flavours, that is what is today referred to as a vintage character. And we have been fairly consistent with it. I'm sure there has been fractional variation over the years, but essentially it's still a young, fresh, vigorous wine.
And how many farmers would you go to for supplying those bottles?
Well, we have about 2,500 different farmers supplying us.
2,500 different farmers in the Douro?
The Douro district is a district of small holdings.
Well, how can you get a consistent product from one bottle to the next? That's amazing.
Well, it's entirely up to blending, really, and the experience of the taster. You know, in my particular case, I've been tasting for the last 30 years, we first select the grapes, and then after making countless different styles, we select the wines with the right profile to give continuity to this rather rich, floral, dark blend of port.
Peter Symington's involvement with each year's wine begins with the grapes. He visits the quintas regularly during the growing season and at harvest. The harvest is such an enchanting scene. The women pick the grapes, delving into the green to find the ripe, sweet bunches. Only the ripe grapes are harvested. And while the women pick, the men carry. And starting by hand, bunch by bunch, the grapes take the first steps in becoming port wine. It's not surprising so many of us enjoy port. Anything that grows in these beautiful surroundings and is picked to the sound of singing just has to taste good. Well, from two vintage characters and this one, this is where it all goes. Warre's Warrior Port. Stay with me. Ports to Remember will be right back. Chocolate, one of the most difficult things to match with wine. But there's one wine that goes beautifully with chocolate, and that is port, especially ruby port. And here we have some chocolates and some chocolate mousse. And if you've never had port and chocolate, you missed out on one of life's great gastronomic experiences. Tawny port, especially aged tawnies like this 20-year-old, go beautifully with food because of their complexity of flavors, especially with dried fruits like figs and dates and apricots, and with soft cheeses. So next time you're at a loss as to what to serve with a brie, try a tawny port. This is a gorgeous 20-year-old tawny. Now, tawnies, because they've been oxidized in the barrel, you can keep in the bottle unopened for at least 4 years if somebody happens to give you a bottle. And once you've opened it, well, you should consume it within about 4 months. You've been watching Ports to Remember. Join me for the next program in the series.